the fortress that shaped two wars, the French and Indian and the Revolutionary War.
Company, halt! By the right, dress! Ready! Present arms!
Nestled between the green slopes of the Adirondacks and the misty shores of Lake Champlain, a stone sentinel stands guard. This is Fort Ticonderoga, a place where history isn't just written in books, but is etched into the very landscape. As the morning fog rolls across the water, it's easy to imagine this fortress not as a tourist destination, but as it once was, a critical bastion of power, a sleeping giant on the northern frontier. For nearly 3 centuries, these walls have witnessed the ebb and flow of empires. The air here feels different, heavy with the echoes of musket fire, the shouts of soldiers, and the silent prayers of those who fought for control of a continent. Its name, an Iroquois word meaning the land between two waters, perfectly captures its strategic importance. It was the key to North America, the place where the destinies of France, Great Britain, and a young, aspiring nation called America would be forged in conflict. Welcome to our journey into the heart of Fort Ticonderoga's history. This isn't just a story about a fort. It's a story about ambition, struggle, and the enduring legacy of a place that shaped the world we live in today. From its construction by the French as Fort Carillon, to its pivotal roles in the French and Indian War and the American Revolution, Ticonderoga has been at the center of it all. Imagine the year is 1755. The forests are dense, the waterways are the only true highways, and the French are determined to secure their hold on the New World. They choose this narrow point on the La Chute River, connecting Lake George to Lake Champlain, to build their fortress. They called it Carillon, meaning chime of bells, inspired by the sound of the nearby waterfalls, but the piece its name suggested would be short. This stronghold was built for war, designed with the most advanced European military engineering of the time. Its star-shaped design, a masterpiece of angles and bastions, was intended to deflect cannonballs and create deadly crossfires for any attacking force. The first major test came in 1758. A massive British army, over 16,000 strong, arrived to seize the fort. They outnumbered the French defenders 4-1. The British commander, General Abercrombie, was so confident of victory that he ordered a frontal assault against the French lines without waiting for his artillery. It was a catastrophic mistake. The French, led by the brilliant Marquis de Montcalm, had constructed formidable defenses of felled trees with sharpened branches, creating an almost impenetrable barrier. For hours, the British regulars, including the famed Black Watch, hurled themselves against these defenses, only to be cut down by relentless musket and cannon fire from the fort's defenders. The Battle of Carillon was a stunning, bloody victory for the French, a moment that cemented the fort's reputation as an impregnable stronghold. The fields below these walls became a graveyard, a testament to the brutal realities of 18th century warfare. But empires rise and fall. Just a year later, in 1759, the British returned under a new commander, Geoffrey Amherst. Learning from the mistakes of the past, Amherst brought overwhelming artillery and began a methodical siege. The French, facing defeat on other fronts and vastly outnumbered, knew they couldn't hold the fort. Under the cover of darkness, they blew up the fort's powder magazine and retreated, abandoning their prized fortress. The Gibraltar of the North had fallen into British hands, and they renamed it Fort Ticonderoga. For the next 16 years, the Union Jack flew over these ramparts, a symbol of British dominance in North America. The fort settled into a period of relative quiet, serving as a remote garrison post, its days of intense conflict seemingly over. But history had other plans. As tensions grew between Great Britain and its American colonies, Ticonderoga's strategic importance once again came into focus. It held a massive cache of artillery cannons, mortars, and howitzers, exactly what the fledgling Continental Army desperately needed to challenge the British forces occupying Boston. In the spring of 1775, just weeks after the shots at Lexington and Concord, a daring plan was hatched. 2 charismatic leaders, Benedict Arnold of Connecticut and Ethan Allen of the newly formed territory of Vermont, Both set their sights on the fort, leading his Green Mountain Boys. A rough-and-tumble militia. Ethan Allen arrived first. In the pre-dawn hours of May 10, 1775, Allen and Arnold led a small force across the lake. They found the main gate unbarred and the single sentry unprepared. Rushing inside, they surprised the sleeping British garrison. Legend has it that Ethan Allen, in his typically bombastic style, stormed up to the commander's quarters and demanded the fort's surrender in the name of the Great Jehovah and the Continental Congress. Whether he actually said those exact words is debated by historians, but the result was the same. The fort was taken without a single shot fired in anger. It was the first major offensive victory for the American cause. A huge morale boost for the Patriots. The capture of Ticonderoga was more than just symbolic. That winter, a young bookseller turned colonel named Henry Knox undertook an incredible feat of logistics and determination. He led an expedition to transport 59 of Ticonderoga, Ese Canon Sauveur, 300 miles of frozen lakes, rivers, and snow-covered mountains to Boston. This noble train of artillery, as it became known, was a game. When General Washington placed those cannons on Dorchester Heights overlooking the city, the British had no choice but to evacuate. The guns of Ticonderoga had liberated Boston, yet the tide of war is ever. By 1777, the British launched a major campaign from Canada to cut New England off from the other colonies. The man leading the charge was General John Burgoyne, and his first objective was to recapture the legendary Fort Ticonderoga. The Americans, now under the command of General Arthur St. Clair, believed the fort was secure. They had strengthened its defenses, but they made a critical oversight. They failed to fortify a nearby peak called Mount Defiance, believing it was too steep to hold artillery to the top. Burgoyne's engineers knew better. Working day and night, they secretly cleared a path and dragged cannons to the summit. On the morning of July 5th, the American defenders awoke to a horrifying sight. British cannons on Mount Defiance aimed directly down into their fort. Their position was completely untenable. To stay and fight would mean certain destruction. Under the cover of darkness, St. Clair and his men evacuated Ticonderoga, abandoning it to the British once again. The loss was a devastating blow to American morale, but it was not the end of the story. Burgoyne's victory here stretched his supply lines and ultimately led him to his fateful surrender at Saratoga, a turning point in the war. After Saratoga, the fort saw little further action. It fell into disrepair, its stones scavenged by local settlers, its mighty walls slowly crumbling back into the earth. For a century, it lay in ruins, a ghost of its former glory, a place of quiet reflection for those who knew its history. It was a sleeping fortress, dreaming of the days when the fate of a continent hung in the balance within its walls. This is just the beginning of the story. The legacy of Ticonderoga is not just in its battles, but in its preservation and rebirth as a place of learning and remembrance. Join us as we continue to explore the layers of history at this incredible site, to walk in the footsteps of soldiers, and to understand how this quiet corner of New York shaped the world. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this journey into the past as fascinating as we do, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories from history. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Welcome back to our journey through history. In Chapter 2, we're diving into a time before the first stone of Fort Ticonderoga was ever laid. To understand why this specific piece of land became one of the most contested spots in North America, it's all about location. Location, location. Imagine a time before highways and railways. The easiest way to travel and move armies was by water. Now, look at a map of Colonial New York. You'll see a natural, almost continuous waterway stretching from the mighty St. Lawrence River in Canada all the way down to the Hudson River in New York City. This incredible natural corridor is formed by two massive lakes, Lake Champlain to the north and Lake George to the south. This chain of lakes and rivers was essentially the superhighway of the 18th century. It was the most direct route connecting the French colonies in Canada with the British colonies in New York. Whoever controlled this passage could control the flow of trade, information, and most importantly, troops between these two vast colonial empires. The French, based in what is now Canada, saw this route as their lifeline to the south, a way to expand their influence in fur trade operations. For them, controlling this corridor was key to containing the British and protecting their vast territory of New France. They could use it to launch raids on British settlements and disrupt their expansion westward. On the other side, the British colonies, particularly New York, were rapidly growing and pushing north. For them, the Lake Champlain-Lake George route was a dagger pointed right at the heart of French Canada. Seizing control of this passage would open the door for a direct invasion of Montreal and Quebec, the seats of French power. It was the key to unlocking the entire continent and achieving dominance in North America. So, this narrow strip of land, this portage connecting these two Great Lakes, became the focal point of immense strategic importance. It was a natural choke point. Think of it like a critical bridge in a modern war. If you hold the bridge, you dictate the movement of everyone around you. This is why, for decades, the wilderness here wasn't a peaceful forest, but a tense frontier, a crossroads where the ambitions of two of the world's greatest empires were destined to collide. Armies from both sides, French regulars, British redcoats, Colonial, and their Native American allies trampled through these woods, paddled these waters, and eyed this very spot with a mix of ambition and fear. They understood that control of this narrow passage meant control of the future of North America. The geography itself dictated the strategy. An army marching north from Albany had to pass this way. An army moving south from Montreal had to pass this way. There was no getting around it. This inherent strategic value is the reason why so many battles were fought here, and why a massive fortress would eventually rise from the earth. The land was crying out for a sentinel, a guardian to watch over this vital corridor. Before a single cannon was mounted, the very lay of the land had already declared this place a battlefield. It was a crossroads of empires, a collision course set by geography, long before the first soldier arrived. The story of Fort Ticonderoga isn't just about a building. It's about the struggle for a continent, and it all started right here, in this natural corridor between two Great Lakes. This strategic tension, simmering for years, was about to boil over. The stage was set for the construction of a fortress that would become a legend, a place that would shape the destiny of nations. Join us in the next chapter as we witness the French make their move and begin to build the formidable stronghold they called Fort Carillon. Thanks for watching. If you're enjoying this deep dive into history, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss what happens next. We love having you on this journey with us. See you in the next episode. Welcome back to our journey through history, right here at the crossroads of the American continent. Last time, we explored the strategic importance of this narrow spit of land. Today, we're re-diving into Chapter 3. The French vision and the birth of a fortress that would become legendary, Fort Carillon. The year is 1755. Tensions between the British and French empires in North America are about to explode. The French, determined to secure their vital trade route, connecting the St. Lawrence River Valley with the Hudson River, knew they needed an anchor, a sentinel to guard this crucial waterway. Their solution? A formidable stone fortress built right here, overlooking the convergence of Lake Champlain and Lake George. They called it Fort Carillon, a name that evokes the sound of ringing bells, perhaps hinting at the alarm it was meant to sound against any British advance. The man tasked with this monumental undertaking was a brilliant French military engineer, Michel Chartier de Lutbinière. He wasn't just building a fort. He was importing the pinnacle of European military architecture into the rugged North American wilderness. The design he chose was a masterpiece of 18th century military engineering, a style perfected by the legendary French engineer, Vauban. The key to its strength: the star-shaped bastion. So, what exactly is a star-shaped bastion? Imagine looking down at the fort from above. Instead of a simple square or rectangle, you'd see a complex, star-like shape. This wasn't for looks. It was pure, deadly function. Each point of the star, or bastion, was a triangular projection. This ingenious design eliminated dead zones, areas where attackers could hide from the fort's cannons and muskets. From the top of one bastion, soldiers could fire down along the face of the adjacent bastions, creating interlocking fields of fire. Any attacking force would be caught in a brutal crossfire, with nowhere to hide. This design made a direct frontal assault almost suicidal. The construction itself was a Herculean effort. Hundreds of French soldiers and Canadian militiamen were put to work. They quarried stone from the surrounding landscape, felling massive trees for timber. The outer walls were built incredibly thick, designed to withstand the pounding of enemy artillery. These weren't just simple stone walls. They were packed with earth and rubble, creating a dense barrier that could absorb the shock of cannonballs without crumbling. The fort rose from the rock, a testament to French ambition and engineering prowess. And the location, it was chosen with surgical precision. Positioned on this peninsula, Fort Carillon had commanding views of the waterways. To the north it watched over the 2-mile portage to Lake Champlain. To the south, it dominated the northern end of Lake George. Any ship, any army, attempting to move between these two vital lakes would have to pass directly under the gaze and the guns of Fort Carillon. It was a choke point, and the French had just placed their hand firmly around its throat. Inside the star-shaped walls, Fort Carillon was a self-contained military community. There were barracks for the soldiers, a bakery to feed them, a powder magazine to store the precious gunpowder, and workshops for blacksmiths and carpenters. It was a small, heavily armed French town, dropped into a landscape that was, until then, primarily the domain of Native American tribes and the occasional fur trapper. For the French soldiers stationed here, thousands of miles from home, it was a small piece of France, a bulwark against the vast and often hostile wilderness. The design also incorporated another key element: outworks. These were smaller, detached fortifications built outside the main walls. Like the redans, these forward positions served as the fort's first line of defense, designed to break up and disorganize an attacking force before they could even reach the main walls. An enemy would have to fight their way through these outer defenses, all while under fire from the fort's primary bastions. It was a defense-in-depth strategy, meant to wear down and demoralize any aggressor. This combination of star-shaped bastions, thick walls, commanding location, and defensive outworks made Fort Carillon one of the most advanced and formidable French colonial forts in North America. It represented the cutting edge of military technology for its time. When the British looked north from their own forts on the Hudson, they didn't just see a stone structure. They saw a powerful statement of French resolve. They saw a dagger aimed at the heart of their colonial ambitions. The construction of Fort Carillon in 1755 fundamentally changed the strategic map of the continent. It was a direct challenge to British authority and set the stage for one of the most famous and bloodiest battles of the French and Indian War, which we'll cover in our next chapter. The French vision, etched in stone and earth by Michel Chartier de Lotbinière, had become a reality. A fortress designed with European sophistication, now stood guard in the American wilderness, waiting for the inevitable storm of war. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the engineering marvel that was Fort Carillon. It is incredible to think about the skill and labor that went into creating this place over 250 years ago. If you found this fascinating, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter, where the cannons of Carillon will finally roar. See you next time. Imagine the bite of a fierce Adirondack winter, the wind howling across the frozen expanse of Lake Champlain. This isn't just a picturesque winter scene. It is the harsh reality faced by the men who built a bastion of French power in the heart of the North American wilderness. This is the story of timber, stone, and sweat, the very foundation of Fort Carillon, later known as Ticonderoga. Forget the romanticized images of grand forts appearing overnight. The construction was a grueling, relentless battle against nature itself. For 3 long years, beginning in 1755, this peninsula was a hive of activity, a symphony of sheer human will set against the backdrop of an untamed forest. The air, thick with a sharp, clean scent of freshly cut pine, was constantly punctuated by the rhythmic clang of hammers on iron and the grating scrape of saws through massive logs. Who were these men, these builders of empire? They were a motley, yet determined, crew. Regular French soldiers from regiments like Lorraine and Languedoc, men more accustomed to the fields of Europe, found themselves trading their muskets for axes and trowels. They weren't just warriors. They were now lumberjacks, quarrymen, and masons, their hands calloused and raw from the unforgiving work. They toiled alongside Canadian militiamen, hardy souls who knew this land and its challenges intimately. Local artisans skilled in their trades were also brought in, their expertise crucial for shaping the stone and timber into a formidable defense. The first order of business was to clear the land. Thousands of ancient trees were felled, their mighty trunks destined to become the fort's palisades and internal structures. Imagine the sheer effort, the straining muscles and coordinated teamwork required to bring down a single one of these giants with nothing more than hand-powered saws and axes. The stumps were then painstakingly removed, the ground leveled by men armed with little more than shovels and brute strength. This was the initial, back-breaking phase that transformed a wild peninsula into a construction site. The fort's design, inspired by the legendary military engineer Vauban, required immense quantities of stone. Soldiers were tasked with quarrying limestone from the nearby shores. They blasted and chiseled tons of rock, which was then hauled to the site on crude sleds, often pulled by the men themselves. TC stones, cold and unyielding, would form the iconic star-shaped walls of the fort, designed to deflect cannonballs and create deadly kill zones for any attacking force. While the soldiers provided the muscle, the brains behind the operation were the French military engineers. They meticulously laid out the plans, translating Vauban's complex geometric principles into a tangible reality on this remote frontier. They supervised every detail, from the angle of the bastions to the thickness of the walls, ensuring that every stone and every log contributed to the fort's defensive strength. Their challenge was immense: to adapt sophisticated European fortification designs to the rugged terrain and limited resources of the New World. Think of the daily life of a soldier laborer. They would rise before dawn, their breath misting in the frigid air. A meager breakfast, perhaps some hard bread and salted pork, would have to sustain them through hours of punishing physical labor. The winters were the most brutal. Snow would blanket the construction site, turning the ground to icy mud. Frostbite was a constant threat, and the simple act of gripping a cold iron tool could be agonizing. Yet, they persevered. They built roaring fires not just for warmth, but to heat the mortar, allowing construction to continue even when the temperatures plummeted. Inside the rising walls, a small village was taking shape. Barracks were erected to house the hundreds of men. Storehouses were built to protect precious supplies of gunpowder and food. A bakery and a forge became the heart of the encampment, providing essential bread and repairing vital tools. Each swing of the hammer, each stone laid in place, was more than just construction. It was a declaration. It was a statement of French ambition, a defiant claim to this strategic corridor connecting Canada to the Hudson Valley. The construction wasn't just a triumph of engineering. It was a testament to human endurance. These men weren't just building a fort. They were pouring their energy, their health, and in some cases, their lives into these walls. They worked through sickness, exhaustion, and the ever-present danger of accidents. The hope that sustained them was the vision of a dominant French empire in North America, with Fort Carillon as its unbreachable southern anchor. As we walk through the restored fort today, it's easy to admire the architecture and the strategic genius. But to truly understand this place, we must listen for the echoes of the past. Hear the ring of the blacksmith's hammer, smell the scent of pine and wood smoke, and feel the phantom chill of that first winter. The timber and stone of Fort Ticonderoga are held together by more than just mortars. They are cemented by the sweat, sacrifice, and unwavering hope of the soldiers who built it. They transformed a wilderness into a fortress, leaving a legacy carved in stone that has endured for centuries. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the construction of one of America's most important historical sites. If you found this story of resilience and ambition as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more journeys into the past. We'd love to have you with us for the next chapter. See you then. Hello, history lovers, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we journey back to the mid-18th century, to a vast and untamed North America. Imagine dense forests stretching for thousands of miles, powerful rivers carving through the landscape, and a continent ripe with opportunity. It was here that two of the world's greatest empires, Great Britain and France, found themselves on a collision course. not just for land, but for the very soul of the continent. This is a story of how that rivalry exploded into the French and Indian War, a conflict that would set the stage for the American Revolution. So, why were they fighting? It really boils down to one word: expansion. The British colonies, clustered along the Atlantic coast, were booming. Their population was growing rapidly, and land-hungry settlers were eager to push westward, over the Appalachian Mountains and into the fertile Ohio River Valley. The problem? The French had already claimed that territory. Their empire, New France, was a vast but sparsely populated network of forts and trading posts, stretching from Quebec down the Mississippi River to Louisiana. For them, the Ohio Valley was the vital link, connecting their Canadian holdings with their southern territories. It was a strategic artery they could not afford to lose. This wasn't just a European squabble on a new continent. It was a deeply complex web of alliances with the original inhabitants of the land, the Native American tribes. Both the French and the British knew they couldn't control North America without native allies. The French, for the most part, had better relationships. They were primarily traders and trappers, often living among native communities, learning their languages, and this fostered a sense of mutual respect and partnership. Tribes like the Algonquin, the Huron, and the Shawnee often sided with the French, seeing them as less of a threat to their lands and way of life compared to the ever-expanding British settlements. On the other hand, the British relationship with native tribes was more complicated and often fraught with tension, while they also engaged in trade. The sheer number of British colonists clearing forests for farms created constant conflict over land. However, the British did have a crucial and powerful ally: the Iroquois Confederacy. This powerful union of 6 nations, including the Mohawk and Seneca, was a dominant force in the Northeast. They skillfully played the French and British against each other, seeking to maintain their own sovereignty and control over the lucrative fur trade. Their allegiance was a massive strategic advantage for the British. The initial sparks of the war flew in the Ohio Valley. In 1754, a young Virginia militia officer was sent to deliver a message to the French, demanding they abandon their forts in the region. That 22-year-old officer's name was George Washington. The mission did not go well. A skirmish broke out, a French diplomat was killed, and Washington was forced to surrender his small force at a hastily built stockade called Fort Necessity. This small, backwoods clash was the first shot in what would become a global conflict, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War. News of the incident reached London and Paris, and what was a colonial dispute quickly escalated into a full-blown war. As the conflict intensified, both sides began constructing and reinforcing forts at key strategic points. These forts were the epicenters of the war, controlling vital rivers, lakes, and portages, and few were as important as a formidable stone fortress built by the French at a critical junction where Lake George meets Lake Champlain. They called it Fort Carillon. The name, which means chime of bells, was inspired by the sound of nearby waterfalls. But there was nothing peaceful about its purpose. Fort Carillon was a dagger pointed at the heart of the British colonies in New York. From here, the French and their native allies could launch devastating raids south, disrupting British supply lines and terrorizing frontier settlements. The British knew they had to take this fort. It became an obsession. The fort's location gave it immense natural defenses. Situated on a promontory, it controlled the Ticonderoga Peninsula, forcing any approaching army into a narrow, predictable path. The French, under the brilliant command of the Marquis de Montcalm, further fortified the position with extensive outer works, trenches, and sharpened log barriers known as abattis. Fort Carillon was more than just a military outpost. It was a symbol of French power and determination in North America. It represented the greatest obstacle to British ambitions of conquering New France. In the summer of 1758, the British mounted their largest campaign of the war to capture it. General James Abercrombie assembled a massive army of over 15,000 British regulars and provincial troops, the largest single force ever gathered in North America. Up to that point, they advanced with overwhelming confidence, their flotilla of boats covering the surface of Lake George. They vastly outnumbered the French defenders, who had fewer than 4,000 men. Victory seemed certain. What followed, however, was one of the most stunning and bloody disasters in British military history. Abercrombie, overconfident and underestimating his opponent, ordered a series of disastrous frontal assaults against the French outer defenses without waiting for his artillery to be brought up. Wave after wave of British soldiers, including the legendary Black Watch Highlanders, charged bravely into a storm of French musket fire. They were cut down in droves, entangled in the abattis and unable to breach the French lines. The French, protected by their well-prepared defenses, inflicted catastrophic casualties, while suffering relatively few themselves. The Battle of Carillon was a humiliating defeat for the British, with nearly 2,000 men killed or wounded. It cemented Montcalm's reputation as a military genius and turned Fort Carillon into a legendary symbol of French resistance. Though a massive setback, the defeat at Carillon only strengthened British resolve. Under the new leadership of Prime Minister William Pitt, the British government poured unprecedented resources into the war. They changed their strategy, blockading the French Navy to cut off supplies and reinforcements to New France. The following year, in 1759, the British returned to this time, facing a much larger and better supplied British force under General Geoffrey Amherst. And with their own supply lines cut, the French knew they couldn't hold the fort. They blew up the fort's powder magazine and retreated north. The British finally captured the strategic location, renaming it Fort Ticonderoga. The fall of Fort Carillon was a turning point. It opened the way for the British to advance into the heart of New France. Later that same year, the British achieved their most decisive victory of the war at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, capturing the city of Quebec. Although the war would officially continue for a few more years, the fate of North America was sealed. The French dream of a North American empire was over. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 formally ended the war, and France ceded all of its territory east of the Mississippi River to Great Britain. The British flag now flew over a vast new empire, but victory came at a staggering cost. The war had doubled Britain's national debt, and London would soon look to its American colonies to help pay for it, planting the seeds of resentment that would blossom into revolution just a decade later. The French and Indian War, which began with a skirmish in the wilderness and centered on forts like Carillon, had not only redrawn the map of North America, but it also set the future nations on an irreversible path to their own destinies. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the beginnings of the French and Indian War. It's a fascinating and crucial chapter in our shared history. If you've enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next historical adventure. Let us know in the comments what part of this story you found most interesting. Until next time, stay curious. Welcome back to our series on the 7 Years' War. Today, we're diving into Chapter 6, The Battle of Carillon, 1758. One of the most stunning upsets in military history. This isn't just a battle. It's a story of desperation, ingenious strategy, and a victory snatched from the jaws of certain defeat. Picture this. It's the summer of 1758. The British Empire, determined to crush French power in North America, has assembled the largest army ever seen on the continent. Over 16,000 professional soldiers and provincial troops, a sea of redcoats and bluecoats, are marching north under the command of General James Abercrombie. Their target, the strategically vital Fort Carillon, which you might know by its later name, Fort Ticonderoga. It controlled the crucial waterway connecting Lake George to Lake Champlain, the main highway for any invasion of Canada. Abercrombie, a cautious but determined commander, was confident. Why wouldn't he be? His intelligence reported that the French garrison at Carillon was small, maybe a few thousand men at most. His plan was simple and brutal. Overwhelm the fort with sheer numbers. The British flotilla, a magnificent sight with over 1,000 boats, moved up Lake George like an unstoppable tide. For the soldiers on board, victory seemed not just possible, but inevitable. They believed they would brush aside the French and be in Montreal within weeks. Waiting for them at Carillon was the Marquis de Montcalm, the commander of French forces in North America. Montcalm was a brilliant and experienced soldier, but he was facing a nightmare scenario. He had just 3,600 men, a mix of French regulars, Canadian militia, and indigenous allies. He was outnumbered more than 4-1. The fort itself, while strategically placed, was not designed to withstand a full-scale siege by an army of this size. It was vulnerable and Montcalm knew it. Retreat was an option, but it meant abandoning the gateway to Canada. Surrender was unthinkable. Montcalm had only one choice: to fight. But how do you fight an army 4 times your size? You don't play by their rules. Montcalm made a bold, almost desperate decision. Instead of hunkering down inside the fort and waiting for the British artillery to blast him to pieces, he would take the fight outside. He ordered his men to construct a defensive line on a low ridge about a kilometer northwest of the fort. This wasn't just a simple trench. It was a masterpiece of 18th century field fortification. His engineers directed the men to build a massive wall of earthen logs, known as an abattis, but this was the key. In front of the wall, they created a dense, tangled mess of felled trees, with their sharpened branches facing the enemy. Imagine trying to run through a forest of spears, all while being shot at from a fortified wall behind it. It was a death trap, designed to break up any orderly attack and expose the advancing soldiers to devastating fire. 4 days, the French soldiers worked feverishly, chopping trees, digging earth, and preparing for the coming storm. They knew their lives, and the fate of New France depended on this wooden wall. Meanwhile, the British vanguard landed and began its advance. Initial skirmishes in the dense woods were chaotic and bloody. In one tragic incident of friendly fire and confusion, the British lost one of their most promising young commanders, Brigadier General George Howe. Howe was the tactical brains of the army, beloved by his men. His death was a massive blow to British morale and leadership, and it may have contributed to the disastrous decisions that followed. Abercrombie, shaken by Howe's death and receiving flawed intelligence that French reinforcements were on their way, made a fatal error in judgment. He was told Montcalm's defenses were flimsy and could be easily stormed. Believing time was against him, he decided to forego bringing up his heavy artillery, which would have fizzily shattered the French log walls. Instead, he ordered a full frontal infantry assault. It was a decision that would go down in infamy. On the morning of July 8, 1758, the British army prepared for battle. The air was thick with humidity and tension. From their makeshift fortress, the French soldiers watched as the forest floor filled with columns of redcoats. The British advanced with parade ground precision, bayonets fixed, drums beating a steady rhythm. They were the most disciplined army in the world, and they expected to march right over the French defenses. Then, Abercrombie gave the order. The attack began. Wave after wave of British regulars charged towards the French line. As they hit the abattis, their perfect formations dissolved into chaos. Soldiers were impaled on sharpened branches, tripped by the tangled logs, and funneled into killing zones. They were sitting ducks. From behind their wall, Montcalm's men unleashed a relentless, disciplined volley fire. The air filled with a deafening roar of musketry and the screams of the wounded. The French, protected by their earthworks, picked off the struggling redcoats with methodical precision. The Highlanders of the 42nd Regiment, the famed Black Watch, made a particularly valiant but suicidal charge. They managed to hack their way through the abattis and reach the base of the wall itself, fighting with claymores and bayonets. But they were cut down in droves. 4 hours. The slaughter continued. Abercrombie, observing from a safe distance, kept sending his men forward into the meat grinder. He seemed incapable of changing his plan, convinced that one more push would break the French line. But the French line did not break. Montcalm was everywhere, moving along the ramparts, encouraging his men, directing their fire. His soldiers, seeing their commanders sharing their danger and inspired by his courage, fought with the ferocity of men defending their homes. They knew that if this wall fell, all was lost. By late afternoon, the ground in front of the abattis was a horrific carpet of red-coated baddies. The British had suffered nearly 2,000 casualties killed, wounded, or missing. The French, by contrast, had lost fewer than 400. Finally, as dusk began to fall, a defeated and demoralized Abercrombie ordered the retreat. It was a rout. The largest army ever assembled in North America was fleeing in panic from a force a quarter of its size. They abandoned equipment, supplies, and their wounded as they scrambled back to their boats. The French, in disbelief, watched them go. They were too exhausted and too few in number to pursue. The news of the victory at Carolina was met with shock and jubilation in Quebec and Paris. It was a monumental triumph, a David and Goliath story that became an instant legend. Montcalm was hailed as a hero. For the British, it was a humiliating and costly defeat. The name Abercrombie became synonymous with incompetence, and he was soon recalled to England in disgrace. The Battle of Carillon was a tactical masterpiece for the French, but it was a strategic delay, not a war-winning victory. The British, with their vast resources, would be back. The very next year, they would bypass Carillon and ultimately capture Quebec. But for one bloody day in July 1758, a small, determined French army, led by a brilliant general, achieved the impossible. They proved that courage, strategy, and a well-placed wall of logs could defy overwhelming odds. The battle remains a testament to French martial prowess, and a brutal lesson in the follies of overconfidence. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter in our history. The story of the 7 Years' War is full of these incredible moments of triumph and tragedy. If you found this as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next chapter. We'd love to have you along for the journey. Until next time, stay curious. Hello, history buffs, and welcome back. Last time, we left the British reeling from a stunning defeat at the hands of Montcalm and his French forces at Fort Carillon. It was a humiliating loss, but the British Empire wasn't one to simply walk away. A year later, in 1759, they were back, and this time they meant business. This new campaign was led by a different kind of General Geoffrey Amherst. Unlike the brash and overconfident Abercrombie, Amherst was cautious, methodical, and determined. He wasn't going to repeat the mistakes of the past. He assembled a formidable force of over 11,000 British regulars and provincial troops, a clear signal that this was no mere skirmish. They were coming to take the fort, and they were prepared for a long, grueling fight. As Amherst's army advanced up Lake George, the situation for the French inside Fort Carillon was looking grim. Their commander, Brigadier General Francois de Bourlamaque, was a capable officer, but he was severely outnumbered. He had only about 3,500 men to defend the fort, and he knew that reinforcements from Montcalm, who was busy defending Quebec, were unlikely to arrive. The strategic landscape had shifted dramatically. The British were no longer just knocking on the door. They were poised to break it down. Bourlamaque faced a terrible choice. He could stay and fight, almost certainly leading to the annihilation of his garrison against Amherst's overwhelming numbers, or he could preserve his army to fight another day, sacrificing the fort in the process. He knew that a hidden defense like the one Montcalm had so brilliantly executed a year prior was impossible. Amherst wasn't going to charge blindly into prepared defenses. Instead, the British began a classic siege, methodically digging trenches and establishing artillery batteries to bombard the fort into submission. The British artillery began to roar, pounding the stone and earth walls of Carillon. For the French soldiers inside, it was a terrifying and demoralizing experience. They were trapped, with a massive army in front of them and a vast wilderness behind. Bourlamaque, seeing the inevitable, made the strategic decision to retreat. His primary goal was to save his men so they could bolster the defenses of other French strongholds, like Alonoé and ultimately Montreal. But he wasn't going to just hand the fort over. Under the cover of darkness on the night of July 26, 1759, the French garrison began their withdrawal. Before they left, they did everything they could to deny the British a fully functional fortress. They loaded the fort's magazine with explosives and set a slow-burning fuse. Their retreat was a race against time. The British, observing the sudden quiet from the fort, grew suspicious. Cautious patrols moved forward and discovered the French were gone. Then, a massive explosion rocked the night. The French had blown up the powder magazine, sending a column of fire and debris into the sky. The blast destroyed the main barracks and storehouses and started fires that gutted many of the fort's wooden structures. It was a final, defiant act. When the sun rose, General Amherst and his troops marched into the smoke and ruined shell of what was once Fort Carillon. It wasn't the glorious victory won through a pitched battle that Abercrombie had dreamed of, but it was a victory nonetheless. The French flag was lowered, and the British Union Jack was raised over the strategic gateway to Canada. The capture of the fort was a pivotal moment in the French and Indian War. The British now controlled the vital waterway connecting Lake George and Lake Champlain, cutting a key French supply line and opening the door for an invasion of Canada from the south. With the fort secured, the British immediately began the process of rebuilding and renaming it. They gave it a new name, one that honored the ancient heritage of the land itself. They called it Fort Ticonderoga. This name came from an Iroquois word, often translated as the land between two waters, a perfect description of its location. On the peninsula separating Lake George from Lake Champlain, this renaming wasn't just a practical matter. It was a symbolic act, wiping the French name from the map and asserting British dominance over this critical piece of North American geography. Amherst, however, didn't immediately press his advantage. Instead of pushing north to attack the retreating French, he spent the rest of the summer and autumn focused on consolidating his position. He put his men to work repairing and strengthening Fort Ticonderoga, transforming the damaged French outpost into a formidable British stronghold. He also initiated the construction of a large fleet of warships on Lake Champlain, recognizing that naval control of the lake was essential for any future campaigns into Canada. This cautious approach, while frustrating to some, was characteristic of Amherst. He was building a secure foundation for the final push that would ultimately lead to the fall of New France. The capture of Fort Ticonderoga in 1759 wasn't just about taking a single fort. It was a critical step in the grand British strategy that would, in the following years, see the surrender of Montreal and the end of French colonial power in North America. The echo of that explosion in the night signaled the beginning of the end for the French Empire in the New World. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey back in time. The story of Ticonderoga is far from over, as it will play another crucial role in a different war just a few years later. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter. See you next time. Welcome back to our journey through the stone and timber of history. After the roar of cannons and the clash of empires faded, Fort Ticonderoga entered a long, quiet slumber. The wars were over, for now, and the once bustling fortress fell silent. Imagine walking these ramparts, not with the tension of an impending attack, but with the gentle breeze coming off the lake as your only companion. The great fort, a sleeping giant, now overlooks still waters. Its purpose, once so clear and violent, began to blur. In the years that followed the French and Indian War, Ticonderoga was a shadow of its former self. The massive barracks, built to house thousands, were now half. A small, skeletal garrison of British soldiers remained, their days marked not by drills and battle preparations, but by the mundane rhythm of peacetime soldiering. Their red coats, once a symbol of imperial might on the march, now added just a splash of color to the quiet, gray stone. The daily routine was one of maintenance, of watching, and of waiting. The strategic importance of the fort had diminished, and it was relegated to the status of a remote, lonely outpost on the fringe of the empire. But life didn't stop. It simply changed its tune. The fort, no longer a primary military objective, evolved. It became a crucial node in the regional economy, transforming into a bustling trading post. Native American traders, local settlers, and merchants would travel for miles to this crossroads of water and land. Furs, timber, grain, and goods from across the Atlantic were exchanged within the shadow of its walls. The courtyard, once a parade ground for soldiers, would have echoed with the chatter of commerce, the haggling over prices, and the mix of English, French, and native languages, a testament to the new, more peaceful reality. This was a different kind of lifeblood for the fort, one driven by trade, not war. This period of tranquility, however, was deceptive. The fort wasn't just a trading post or a sleepy garrison. It was a silent witness. As the 1760s bled into the 1770s, the winds of change began to blow from the south. Down in the bustling colonial cities of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, a new storm was brewing. Whispers of discontent grew into shouts of protest. Ideas of liberty, representation, and self-governance were taking root, and the relationship between the American colonies and Great Britain was becoming increasingly strained. The soldiers stationed at Ticonderoga isolated as they were, would have heard news and rumors carried by traveling merchants and new recruits. They were standing on a fault line, a place that had defined the boundary of empires and was about to be caught up in the birth of a new nation. Think of the fort as a character in our story, listening. It heard the colonial grievances over taxes. It felt the tremors of events like the Boston Massacre, and it stood as a symbol of the very British authority that was being challenged. The cannons that had once fired on the French were still there, silent and cold, but their potential was not forgotten. Men with foresight, both British and American, knew that if conflict were to erupt, this strategic location, the gateway to the continent, would once again become a prize of immense value. The peace was just an interlude, a quiet breath held before the plunge. The garrison itself was a microcosm of the growing divide. While they wore the king's uniform, many of the soldiers were from the colonies. Their loyalties, like the colonies themselves, were becoming complex and strained. Imagine a soldier from Massachusetts, serving under a British officer, hearing news from home about protests against the crown. The conversations in the mess halls and taverns must have been filled with a quiet tension, a debate between duty to the king and sympathy for their countrymen. Ticonderoga, in its slumber, was a place of divided hearts, a reflection of the continent's own internal struggle. This era, often overlooked between the grand clashes of war, is crucial to understanding what came next. It was during these quiet years that the fort's legend simmered. It was a place of history, a place captured by Abercrombie's failure and Amherst's success, but it was also becoming a place of future importance. Its massive store of artillery, over 100 cannons, and mortar lay waiting. To the budding revolutionary movement, Ticonderoga wasn't just a fort. It was an arsenal, a key that could unlock the military potential of the colonies. The sleeping giant was about to be awoken, not by the drums of a European empire, but by the revolutionary fervor of its own people. The quiet between the wars was coming to an end. The stage was being set for one of the most daring and consequential moments in the fort's history, and in the story of America itself. As we stand on the cusp of the American Revolution, the peace at Fort Ticonderoga feels fragile, like a thin sheet of ice over a deep, powerful current. The next chapter of its story will be written not by kings and generals in distant capitals, but by farmers, blacksmiths, and rebels. With a bold and audacious plan, thank you so much for joining me for this part of our exploration. The story is only getting more exciting from here. If you're enjoying this journey through history, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. We'll see you in the next episode. Hey everyone, welcome back to our historical journey. Today, in Chapter 9, we're diving into a period of rising tension, of hushed conversations in taverns, and of secret meetings that would change the world forever. We're talking about the whispers of rebellion. Now, you'll remember from our previous episodes, the fort we've been following has seen its share of action. It's been a frontier outpost, a trading hub, and a symbol of colonial power. But as the 1760s rolled into the 1770s, the mood in the American colonies began to sour. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Boston Massacre. Each event was like a drumbeat, getting louder and more insistent. People were growing restless, feeling that their rights as Englishmen were being trampled on by a distant parliament and king. And as this restlessness grew, the fort took on a new, critical importance. It wasn't just a symbol anymore. It was a prize. Think about it. What do you need to turn whispers of rebellion into an actual revolution? You need courage, you need people, and you absolutely need weapons. The American Revolution didn't begin with a grand declaration. It began with the urgent need for military supplies. Suddenly, eyes turned back to our fort. Why? Because locked within its stone walls was everything an aspiring rebel army could dream of. We're talking about stacks of muskets, barrels of gunpowder, and most importantly, cannons. Those heavy guns, once meant to defend the colony from external threats, were now seen as the key to challenging the very authority that put them there. The strategic location of the fort was another major factor. It commanded key waterways and travel routes. Whoever held the fort could control the movement of troops and supplies throughout the entire region. For the Crown, it was a vital link in their chain of command. For the burgeoning patriot cause, capturing it would be a massive strategic and symbolic victory. It would not only arm their soldiers but also sever a critical artery of British control. Local committees of safety, the shadow governments of the rebellion, began to secretly assess the fort's defenses. How many soldiers were stationed there? What were their routines? Were the guards loyal to the crown, or could their sympathies lie with the colonies? Spies, disguised as merchants or farmers, would gather information, pacing out the walls, noting the placement of the cannons, and listening for any loose talk from the garrison. These weren't soldiers yet. They were ordinary people, blacksmiths, farmers, lawyers who were being pushed towards extraordinary actions. The idea of taking a military installation was daunting, even treasonous. But the whispers were getting louder. If we're to fight for our freedom, they'd say, we need those guns. We need those cannons. The fort was no longer just a backdrop to colonial life. It was about to become a central stage for the opening act of the American Revolution. The question on everyone's mind was not asterisk, if asterisk someone would make a move on the fort, but asterisk, when asterisk, and who would be brave enough to strike the first blow. Imagine the tension inside the fort's walls during this time. The commander, likely a career British officer, would have heard the same whispers. He would have received reports of growing unrest and perhaps even direct orders from his superiors in Boston or London to be on high alert. Every farmer's cart that approached the gate, every ship that sailed past on the river, could be part of a potential plot. He had to maintain discipline among his own men, whose loyalties might be divided, while projecting an image of unshakable strength to the restless population outside. The air was thick with paranoia. The garrison would have increased its patrols, doubled the sentries at night, and meticulously checked every single person and wagon coming in and out. The heavy iron gates, once open during the day for commerce and travel, might now be shut more often, creating a very clear line between the authority of the crown inside and the simmering resentment of the colonists outside. This physical barrier mirrored the growing political and ideological divide that was splitting the British Empire apart. Meanwhile, in the nearby towns, the Patriot leaders were planning. Figures like Samuel Adams and John Hancock were orchestrating a network of communication and resistance. Riders on horseback, the unsung heroes of the early revolution, carried secret messages between colonies, coordinating efforts. A message might arrive in the dead of night, detailing the fort's vulnerabilities or passing along intelligence from a sympathetic source within the walls. The plan to take the fort would have to be perfect. A frontal assault was likely suicide against trained soldiers and cannon. It had to be a surprise, a swift action that could overwhelm the garrison before they could mount a proper defense or call for reinforcements. This is where local knowledge became invaluable. The rebels knew the terrain. They knew the hidden paths through the woods, the shallow points in the river, and the parts of the wall that might be easiest to scale under the cover of darkness. This period, right before the first shots were fired, is one of the most fascinating in American history. It's a high-stakes chess match. On one side, you have the established power of the British military, with its discipline, resources, and experience. On the other, you have a passionate, determined, and resourceful group of colonists who are fighting for the idea of self-governance. The fort, with its precious military supplies, became the focal point of this struggle. Its capture would be a point of no return. It would be a clear and undeniable act of rebellion, transforming whispers into a declaration of war. The cannons that were meant to enforce the king's law would be turned against his own troops. The seeds of revolution, sown by years of political discontent, were about to sprout in the shadow of the fort's walls. The next move would ignite a conflict that would forge a new nation. The moment of truth arrived, not with a roar, but with stealth and shadow. On a moonless night, a small, determined band of patriots, armed with little more than courage and a few hunting rifles, approached the fort. They moved like ghosts through the forest they knew so well, their footsteps muffled by the damp earth. Their leader, a man respected in the community, had a simple but audacious plan, born from the intelligence they had so carefully gathered. They didn't charge the main gate. Instead, they exploited a weakness, a small, less guarded section of the wall near a service entrance that a sympathetic contact inside had left unbarred. One by one, they slipped over the wall, their hearts pounding in their chests. The risk was immense. If a single sentry spotted them, the alarm would be raised, and the mission would end in a hail of musket fire. Once inside, They split into pre-assigned teams. One group moved swiftly to secure the barracks, surprising the sleeping soldiers before they could even grab their weapons. Another team, led by a local blacksmith who knew his way around machinery, went straight for the cannons, their primary objective. With practiced efficiency, they began the process of disabling the firing mechanisms of any guns they couldn't immediately seize, ensuring they couldn't be used against them. The fort's commander was awakened not by a gunshot, but by the firm grip of a rebel leader at his bedside, demanding his surrender in the name of the Continental Congress, a body the commander barely recognized as legitimate. Faced with the reality of his surprised and disarmed garrison, and with patriots controlling the key points of his own fort, he had little choice. In a matter of hours, with barely a shot fired, the formidable fortress, a symbol of British might, had fallen. The news spread like wildfire. The capture of the fort was a stunning success. It was a massive morale boost for the patriot cause across all 13 colonies. It proved that the seemingly invincible British Army was, in fact, vulnerable. More practically, the rebels now had what they desperately needed: cannons, muskets, and tons of ammunition. Wagons were brought in, and the process of moving the heavy artillery began immediately. These were the very cannons that would later be painstakingly dragged hundreds of miles to Boston, placed on Dorchester Heights, and used to force the British to evacuate the city. The strategic impact of this single, daring raid cannot be overstated. It was a pivotal moment in the beginnings of the American Revolution, turning the tide of the early conflict and equipping a fledgling army to stand against an empire. The whispers had finally become a roar that would echo through history. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible chapter of our story. The bravery and strategic thinking of these early patriots are truly inspiring. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next episode. We love hearing from you, so drop your thoughts and questions in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. The moon hung like a silver sliver in the inky black sky over Lake Champlain. It was the early hours of May 10th, 1775. Inside the stone walls of Fort Ticonderoga, the British garrison slept soundly. They were the sentinels of a global empire, secure in a fortress nicknamed the Gibraltar of North America. They had no idea that history was about to be made, not with the roar of cannons, but with the quiet shuffle of boots on damp earth. Outside the walls, a strange and rugged group of men gathered in the pre-dawn chill. They weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They were frontiersmen, farmers, and woodsmen from the New Hampshire grants, a disputed territory that would one day become Vermont. They called themselves the Green Mountain Boys, and they were led by a man as wild and untamed as the mountains he came from, Ethan Allen. He was a giant of a man, known for his booming voice, his philosophical writings, and a temper that could shake the leaves from the trees. Alongside him stood another ambitious man, equally bold but of a different sort, Benedict Arnold. Sent by the Massachusetts Committee of Safety, Arnold arrived with official orders to take the fort, but with no men to command. Allen's Green Mountain Boys, fiercely loyal to their leader, refused to march under anyone else. After a heated argument, the two headstrong leaders agreed to a joint command, a fragile alliance born of necessity. Their plan was audacious to the point of madness, a surprise, nighttime assault. The element of surprise was everything. The fort's defenses were formidable, but its garrison was small, less than 50 men, many of them invalids or older soldiers. Their commander, Captain William de Loveless, was confident, perhaps too confident, in the fort's reputation. He had dismissed earlier rumors of a potential attack as colonial bluster. The first challenge was crossing the lake. The Green Mountain Boys had scrounged 4 boats, but they could only find a few. As the minutes ticked by, it became clear they couldn't get all 200 of their men across before sunrise would expose them. Allen knew he couldn't wait. A choice had to be made. With Benedict Arnold at his side, he crammed about 85 of his best men into the available boats and pushed off into the dark, silent water. The rest would have to follow if and when they could. The boats glided across the lake like ghosts. The only sounds were the gentle dip of oars and the lapping of water against the hulls. As they reached the western shore, the men disembarked in silence, melting into the shadows at the base of the fortress. The first rays of dawn were just beginning to streak the eastern sky. Time was running out. Allen gathered his small force. He didn't deliver a thundering speech. Instead, in a hushed, intense whisper, he laid out the stakes. This was their moment. This was for liberty. He drew his sword, its steel glinting faintly in the dim light. They crept towards a wicket gate, a small side entrance left carelessly unbarred. The single sentry was on duty. He spotted the approaching figures and raised his musket, but it misfired in the damp morning air. The sentry turned and fled into the fort to raise the alarm, with the rebels hot on his heels. But there was no grand alarm, no call to arms. The Green Mountain Boys swarmed through the gate and into the main parade ground before the sleepy garrison could even register what was happening. They fanned out, their movements swift and practiced. Some of the British soldiers, roused from their bunks by the commotion, stumbled out into the square, half-dressed and bewildered. They were met not by a volley of musket fire, but by the sight of wild-looking frontiersmen letting out a whooping war cry that echoed off the stone barracks. The psychological shock was total. The fight was over before it began. Ethan Allen, with Arnold still beside him, stormed up the wooden staircase to the officers' quarters. He pounded on the door with the hilt of his sword, his voice finally unleashed in its full, booming power. "Come out of there, you old rat," he bellowed. Captain de Lapley appeared at the door, pulling on his trousers, his wife peering from behind him. He was utterly baffled. "By what authority do you demand my surrender?" he asked, trying to gather some semblance of his command. And then came the legendary reply. What Ethan Allen said next would be printed in newspapers, repeated in taverns, and etched into the mythology of the American Revolution. He drew himself up to his full height, his eyes blazing, and declared, in the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress. It was a masterful, if not entirely accurate, piece of theater. The Continental Congress hadn't authorized the attack and likely didn't even know it was happening yet. But in that moment, in the center of a captured British fort, it didn't matter. The authority was in the cold steel of the swords, the determined faces of the Green Mountain Boys, and the undeniable reality of the situation. Captain de Laplace, seeing his men already disarmed and the fort completely overrun, had no choice. He surrendered his sword. Fort Ticonderoga, the key to the continent, had been taken, and it had been taken without a single shot fired in anger, without a single life lost. The British soldiers awoke from their dreams, not to the thunder of battle, but to the bewildering silence of defeat. They were prisoners in their own fortress, captured by a phantom army that had materialized out of the morning mist. The spoils were immense. The fort held nearly 100 cannons, along with mortars, howitzers, and tons of cannonballs and gunpowder. These were supplies the fledgling Continental Army desperately needed. Later that winter, another future legend, Henry Knox, would mastermind the heroic effort to haul this artillery over 300 miles of snow and ice to Boston. Those very cannons, placed on Dorchester Heights, would force the British to evacuate the city, securing the first major strategic victory for the American cause. The capture of Fort Ticonderoga was more than just a military victory. It was a profound psychological blow to the British and a massive morale boost for the colonists. It proved that a determined group of patriots could challenge the might of the British Empire and win. It was a story of audacity, of daring, and of a silent, ghostly raid that changed the course of a war. And it all began in the quiet, eerie stillness of a May morning, when a giant from the Green Mountains demanded a fort surrender in a name far greater than his own. Thank you so much for watching this chapter of our American History series. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more Tales of the Revolution. We'll see you in the next video. Imagine this. It's the dead of night, May 10th, 1775. The world is holding its breath. The first shots of the American Revolution have been fired at Lexington and Concord, but the colonists have yet to score a decisive victory. They need cannons, they need supplies, and they need a wind to boost morale. Their eyes turn north, to a formidable stone fortress on the shores of Lake Champlain, Fort Ticonderoga, and to one of the most larger-than-life characters of the entire war, Ethan Allen, a giant of a man, both in stature and in spirit, leading his band of roof-and-tumble frontiersmen, the legendary Green Mountain Boys. Alongside them is another ambitious officer you might have heard of, Benedict Arnold. Also eager to claim the prize of Ticonderoga for the Continental cause. After a brief, tense power struggle, they agree to a joint command, a fragile alliance for a high-stakes mission. Their plan is audacious, bordering on insane. They would cross the dark, choppy waters of Lake Champlain under the cover of darkness and storm the fort in a surprise pre-dawn raid. But there's a problem. They don't have enough boats. As the minutes tick by and the first hints of dawn threaten to expose their position, Allen knows he can't wait for the entire force to cross. He makes a bold decision. With just 83 men, a fraction of his total force, he will take the fort. It's now or never. They land silently on the northern shore, shadows moving through the pre-dawn gloom. The air is cold, filled with the scent of lake water and damp earth. Allen gathers his men. He gives them a final, fiery speech, reminding them of the tyranny they fight against and the glory that awaits. With hearts pounding, they move forward. They find a wicket gate, a small side entrance, left inexplicably unlocked. A single sentry spots them, raises his musket, but it misfires. He turns and flees into the fort, with the Americans hot on his heels. The Green Mountain Boys pour into the parade ground, letting out a war whoop that shatters the morning silence. They quickly overwhelm the few startled guards. The fort's garrison, only about 48 men, had grown complacent. They believed they were safe, far from the conflict brewing in mass. They were wrong. The Americans fan out, securing the barracks where the British soldiers are still sound asleep. The whole affair is over in less than 10 minutes, without a single shot being fired in anger. It's a stunningly swift and bloodless capture. Now comes the moment that will echo through history. Ethan Allen, with Benedict Arnold at his side, storms up the stairs to the officers' quarters. He pounds on the door with the hilt of his sword, demanding the fort's commander show himself. A groggy lieutenant, a man named Jocelyn Feltham, appears at the door, still pulling on his trousers, completely bewildered. He looks at the towering figure of Allen, flanked by his wild-looking frontiersmen, and asks the obvious question. By what authority do you demand this fort and Harry D's? The quote that defines the man and the moment? Allen, drawing himself up to his full, intimidating height, bellows his legendary reply. In the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress. It's a perfect blend of divine authority and revolutionary defiance. It's bold, it's dramatic, it's pure, Ethan Allen. The sleepy British officer, faced with this force of nature, has no choice. He leads Allen to the commandant, Captain William de la Place, who, seeing the hopeless situation, formally surrenders the fort. The capture of Fort Ticonderoga was the first American victory of the Revolutionary War. It was a massive morale booster for the fledgling rebellion, but more importantly, it yielded a treasure trove of over 100 pieces of heavy artillery cannons, mortar, and howitzer. These were the very cannons that another future hero, Henry Knox, would later haul hundreds of miles across the frozen mountains of New England in an incredible feat of logistics. These same cannons would be placed on Dorchester Heights overlooking Boston, forcing the British to evacuate the city and giving the Continental Army another crucial early victory. So the next time you hear that famous phrase, in the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress, remember the scene? Remember the cold pre-dawn light on Lake Champlain, the daring handful of Green Mountain Boys, and the towering, fiery leader who, with a few powerful words and an audacious plan, seized a fortress and armed a revolution. It was a quiet triumph that morning, but its repercussions were loud enough to help forge a new nation. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you enjoyed this story and want to learn more about the incredible moments that shaped history, be sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you won't miss our next chapter. We'll see you next time. Hello history buffs, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we're diving into one of the most incredible, almost unbelievable stories of the American Revolution. It's a tale of sheer grit, ingenuity, and determination that literally changed the course of the war. We're talking about the noble train of artillery and the man behind it all, a 25-year-old bookseller named Henry Knox. So, picture this. It's the winter of 1775. The newly formed Continental Army has the British trapped in Boston. It's a siege, but it's a stalemate. The Americans have the manpower, but they lack the heavy firepower needed to force the British out. General George Washington knows he needs cannons, big ones, but where could he possibly get them? The answer lay hundreds of miles away, at a recently captured British fort on the New York frontier, Fort Ticonderoga. Back in May, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold had surprised the British garrison and seized the fort, along with its massive arsenal of cannons, mortars, and howitzers. Teep problem. Ticonderoga was over 300 miles from Boston, separated by dense forests, frozen rivers, and the formidable Berkshire Mountains. Getting those guns to Boston seemed impossible. This is where our hero, Henry Knox, steps into the picture. Knox was a Boston bookseller with no military experience, but he had a brilliant mind and an insatiable appetite for military engineering, which he'd learned entirely from books. He volunteered for the mission, and Washington, desperate and impressed by Knox's confidence, gave him the go-ahead. In November 1775, Knox set off on his epic journey. Arriving at Ticonderoga, he was met with a monumental task. He had to select the best pieces of artillery. 59 of them, to be exact, including massive 18 and 24-pounder cannons. The total weight, a staggering 60 tons, or 120,000 pounds. Now, how do you move 60 tons of metal through the wilderness with 18th century technology? Knox's plan was audacious. He decided to use the harsh New England winter to his advantage. He would wait for the lakes and rivers to freeze over and for snow to cover the ground. He and his men constructed 42 heavy-duty sleds, and with teams of oxen, they began the painstaking process of dragging the artillery. The journey began on December 9th. It was an absolute ordeal from the start. They had to haul the massive cannons up and down steep icy hills. They navigated treacherous, poorly marked trails. One of the biggest challenges was crossing the Hudson River. At one point, a sled carrying a huge cannon crashed through the ice. It took hours of frantic work in the freezing water for Knox and his men to retrieve it. They faced blizzards, thaws that turned the roads into muddy quagmires, and the constant threat of exhaustion and frostbite. Can you imagine the sheer physical labor, day after day, in sub-zero temperatures, pushing, pulling, and willing these massive metal beasts forward? Knox's letters from this time reveal his incredible leadership. He was constantly encouraging his men, solving problems on the fly, and refusing to give up, no matter how bleak things looked. He wrote about the mountains being almost impassable, yet he pressed on. One of the most remarkable parts of this journey was crossing the Berkshire Mountains in western Massachusetts. The terrain was brutal, with steep inclines and declines covered in ice and snow. Local villagers, amazed by the spectacle, came out to help, providing fresh oxen and manpower to get the sleds over the peaks. It was a true community effort, fueled by the hope of liberating Boston. After nearly 3 brutal months, on January 24th, 1776, a triumphant Henry Knox arrived in Cambridge, just outside Boston. The noble train of artillery, as it came to be known, had made it. It was a logistical miracle, one of the greatest feats of the entire war. The sight of these cannons rolling into the American camp must have been an incredible boost to morale. Now, Washington had the tools he needed. Under the cover of darkness on the night of March 4th, 1776, his troops worked feverishly. They quietly moved Knox's cannons and thousands of soldiers to a strategic high ground, overlooking Boston, called Dorchester Heights. The next morning, the British awoke to a shocking sight. The hills, which had been bare the day before, were now bristling with American cannons, all aimed directly at their ships in the harbor and their troops in the city. The British commander, General William Howe, knew he was in an impossible position. He couldn't attack the fortified heights, and he couldn't stay in Boston under the threat of constant bombardment. His fleet was a sitting duck. He had no choice. On March 17th, 1776, the British evacuated Boston, sailing away to Halifax, Nova Scotia, without a single shot being fired from those cannons. Henry Knox's incredible winter journey had forced the British to abandon the city they had occupied for years. It was a massive victory for the Continental Army and a huge turning point in the early days of the Revolution. It proved that the American forces, through sheer ingenuity and willpower, could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Henry Knox went on to become Washington's chief of artillery and later the nation's first Secretary of War. But it was this daring 300-mile trek through the snow that cemented his legend. The story of the noble train of artillery is a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest battles aren't won with bullets, but with brains, bravery, and the unshakable will to succeed against all odds. Thank you so much for joining us for this incredible story. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't even miss our next deep dive into history. Let us know in the comments what other revolutionary stories you'd like to see. Until next time, stay curious. Welcome back to our journey through the American Revolution. Last time, we saw Washington's incredible victories at Trenton and Princeton, which breathed new life into the American cause. But as the snows of 1777 melted, the British were far from defeated. They were planning a major new offensive, one they believed would finally crush the rebellion for good. This is the story of the Saratoga Campaign, a series of events that would dramatically change the course of the war. The British High Command in London devised a grand three-pronged strategy. The main thrust would come from the north. General John Burgoyne, a charismatic and ambitious officer, was to lead a massive army of over 8,000 British regulars, German mercenaries, Native American allies, and Canadian loyalists south from Canada. His objective was to advance down the Lake Champlain-Hudson River corridor and capture the strategically vital city of Albany, New York. Simultaneously, a smaller force under Colonel Barry St. Leger would move east from Lake Ontario through the Mohawk Valley, also heading for Albany. The third prong, led by General William Howe, the overall British commander in America, was supposed to march his main army north from New York City to meet Burgoyne and St. Leger in Albany. The plan looked brilliant on paper. By controlling the Hudson River, the British would effectively sever New England, the heart of the Revolution, from the rest of the colonies. It was a classic divide-and-conquer strategy, and the British were confident it would be the final, decisive blow. Burgoyne, nicknamed Gentleman Johnny for his love of high society and flair for the dramatic, set off from Canada in June 1777. His army was a magnificent spectacle, with its scarlet-coated regulars, Hessians in their towering hats, and a massive artillery train. It was a powerful, professional force, and its first major target was the formidable American bastion of Fort Ticonderoga. This fortress, located at the southern end of Lake Champlain, was known as the Gibraltar of the North. It had been captured by the Americans back in 1775 and was a powerful symbol of their early success. The American commander at Ticonderoga, General Arthur St. Clair, had about 3,000 men, a mix of Continental soldiers and militia. He was confident in his position. The fort was strong, well-armed, and seemed impregnable. However, there was a critical flaw in its defenses, a flaw the British were about to exploit with devastating effect. Overlooking Fort Ticonderoga was a high, rocky peak called Sugarloaf Hill, later renamed Mount Defiant. The Americans had considered fortifying it but deemed it too steep and difficult to haul cannons to the top. They believed it was impossible for the British to do so. This was a fatal miscalculation. Burgoyne's engineers saw the opportunity immediately. Under the direction of General William Phillips, an expert artillerist, British troops began the Herculean task of secretly cutting a path up the rugged slope of Sugarloaf. Working tirelessly day and night, they dragged heavy cannons and mortars to the summit. On the morning of July 5th, the American garrison at Ticonderoga awoke to a horrifying sight. High above them, on a peak they thought was inaccessible, were British cannons aimed directly down into their fort. The American position had become completely untenable. Every part of the fort was exposed to British bombardment. General St. Clair was faced with an impossible choice: stay and face certain annihilation, or abandon the fortress. There was no real choice at all. A council of war quickly decided to retreat. Under the cover of darkness, the American army began a desperate evacuation. To create a diversion, they set fire to some buildings and fired a few cannons. But the retreat was chaotic. An accidental fire illuminated their escape route, alerting the British, who immediately gave chase. The British had retaken Fort Ticonderoga, one of America's most important strongholds, almost without firing a shot. The news was a massive blow to American morale and a huge victory for the British. In London, King George III was said to have burst into the Queen's chambers, exclaiming, "I have beat them! I have beat all the Americans." The fall of Ticonderoga sent shockwaves through the colonies. The public and Congress were outraged. How could such a powerful fort fall so easily? General St. Clair and his superior, General Philip Schuyler, were widely blamed for the disaster. John Adams wrote that he was chagrined, and that we shall never be able to defend a post until we shoot a general. The loss was a humiliating setback, and it seemed as though Burgoyne's march to Albany would be an unstoppable victory parade. But war is unpredictable. As Burgoyne pushed deeper into the dense wilderness of upstate New York, his initial triumph began to unravel. The retreating Americans, under the shrewd command of General Schuyler, implemented a scorched earth policy. They felled massive trees across the narrow roads, destroyed bridges, dammed creeks to create swamps, and burned crops. This turned Burgoyne's advance into a grueling, slow-motion nightmare. His massive army, with its long baggage train, could only cover a mile or two on a good day. The supply lines, stretching all the way back to Canada, became dangerously long and vulnerable to American raids. Meanwhile, the American forces were regrouping. The initial panic after Ticonderoga was replaced by a grim determination. Militia from New England and New York began to flock to join the Northern Army. Burgoyne's use of Native American allies also backfired terribly. While they were effective scouts, their raids on isolated settlements, particularly the widely publicized death of a young woman named Jane McCrae, inflamed colonial anger. Instead of terrifying the local population into submission, it galvanized them into fierce resistance. More and more men picked up their muskets and headed out to stop. "Gentleman Johnny." Burgoyne's army was running desperately low on food, horses, and supplies. Hearing of a large American supply depot at Bennington, Vermont, he dispatched a force of about 800 men, mostly German mercenaries, to capture Italiano. On August 16th, this force was met by a determined group of New Hampshire and Vermont militia, led by General John Stark. Stark, a veteran of Bunker Hill, famously told his men, "There are your enemies, the Redcoats and the Tories. They are ours, or this night Molly Stark sleeps a widow." The battle that followed was a disaster for the British. The American frontiersmen, fighting on their home turf, surrounded and virtually annihilated the professional German soldiers. It was a stunning American victory and a devastating blow to Burgoyne. He had not only failed to get his much-needed supplies, but he had also lost nearly 1,000 of his best men. The victory at Bennington was a huge morale booster for the Americans and a critical turning point in the campaign. It proved that the militia could stand up to and defeat British regulars. As Burgoyne's situation grew more desperate, the American army grew stronger. Congress, still reeling from the loss of Ticonderoga, replaced General Schuyler with General Horatio Gates, a former British officer. While Gates was not the brilliant field commander that Schuyler was, he was a good administrator and was popular with the New England troops. He was also joined by one of the most dynamic and aggressive commanders in the American army, Benedict Arnold. By early September, Burgoyne's army was isolated and in serious trouble. St. Leger's expedition in the Mohawk Valley had been turned back, and General Howe, instead of marching north to Albany, had decided to move his army by sea to capture the American capital of Philadelphia. Burgoyne was completely on his own, deep in enemy territory, with a growing American army blocking his path to Albany. His grand plan was falling apart. He had two choices: retreat back to Canada or risk everything on a final push to Albany. Ever the gambler, gentleman Johnny Burgoyne chose to fight. The stage was set for a decisive confrontation near a small town on the Hudson River called Saratoga, and what happened there would change the world. We'll dive into the epic battles of Saratoga in our next episode. Thank you so much for watching. The story of the Saratoga campaign is a testament to the resilience and fighting spirit of the American forces. If you found this video interesting, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more chapters in this incredible story. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next episode. We'll see you then. Hello, history buffs, and welcome back to our deep dive into the story of Fort Ticonderoga. In today's chapter, we're exploring a quieter, more melancholic period in the fort's life. Its long abandonment and gradual decline. After the pivotal Battle of Saratoga in 1777, where General Burgoyne's British army suffered a stunning defeat, the entire strategic landscape of the American Revolution shifted. For Fort Ticonderoga, which had been a linchpin of military strategy for decades, this change was profound. Suddenly, its importance evaporated. The war moved south, and the great stone fortress on Lake Champlain was left behind, a silent spectator to the conflict it once commanded. The Continental Army, facing more pressing needs elsewhere, officially abandoned the fort in November 1777. A small garrison of British and German troops briefly reoccupied it, but their stay was short-lived. By 1781, with the tide of war turning decisively in America's favor, the British permanently withdrew, leaving Ticonderoga to the mercy of time and nature. The cannons were removed, the gates were left open, and an eerie silence descended upon the once bustling parade grounds. The fort, which had echoed with the tramp of marching feet, the crack of muskets, and the commands of generals, now heard only the whisper of the wind through its empty barracks. This marked the beginning of what we can call the fort's long sleep. For nearly a century, Ticonderoga was left to crumble. It became a ghost of its former self, a romantic ruin on the shores of the lake. Nature, the ultimate conqueror, began its slow, relentless reclamation. The massive wooden structures, like the barracks and storehouses, were the first to go. Without maintenance, their timbers succumbed to the harsh upstate New York winters. Roofs collapsed, floors gave way, and walls rotted, until only skeletal frames remained, and then nothing at all. Imagine walking through those grounds in the 1820s or 1830s. You would have seen the proud stone walls, the ramparts, still standing firm, but everything within them was returning to the earth. The stone ramparts themselves, symbols of Ticonderoga's strength, began to show the effects of neglect. Frost and ice worked their way into the mortar, slowly prying the stones apart. Moss, lichens, and then small saplings took root in the crevices, their tendrils gripping the walls like green fingers, gradually blurring the sharp, man-made lines of the fortifications. The very ground that had been packed hard by thousands of soldiers, soft and sprouted with wildflowers and tall grasses. Deer and other wildlife wandered freely through the broken gateways, reclaiming a domain that had been theirs long before any flag was ever raised. But even in its decay, Ticonderoga held a powerful allure. It became a destination not for soldiers, but for artists, writers, and early tourists. People drawn to the romanticism of ruins and the echoes of history. In the early 19th century, painters of the Hudson River School were captivated by the sight of the crumbling fortress set against the dramatic backdrop of the lake and mountains. Their canvases captured the melancholy beauty of the scene, portraying the fort as a noble relic of a heroic past, slowly surrendering to the sublime power of nature. These images helped cement Ticonderoga's place in the American imagination, not just as a military site, but as a place of historical poetry. Writers like James Fenimore Cooper were also inspired by the fort's legacy. Although his famous novel, The Last of the Mohicans, is set during the French and Indian War, the ruined state of the fort in his own time likely fueled his imagination. The overgrown ramparts and silent courtyards were the perfect setting for tales of frontier adventure, bravery, and conflict. The fort was transforming from a place of active history into a source of national myth and legend. However, the abandonment also led to a different kind of plunder. Locals, seeing the vast quantities of unattended building materials, began to borrow from the fort. Stones from the walls were carted away to build foundations for nearby farmhouses and chimneys. Timbers that hadn't yet rotted were repurposed. In a way, the fort was being physically dismantled and scattered across the surrounding landscape, becoming part of the very fabric of the communities that grew up in its shadow. This practice, while understandable from a practical standpoint, accelerated the fort's decline and threatened to erase its physical history entirely. For decades, this was the state of Fort Ticonderoga, a silent, decaying monument. Its strategic importance was gone, its garrisons long departed, and its physical structure slowly vanishing. It seemed as though the fort's story might end here, as a pile of picturesque rubble remembered only in paintings and books. But, as we'll discover in our next chapter, the story of Ticonderoga was far from over. A new chapter of restoration and preservation was on the horizon, one that would awaken the sleeping giant on Lake Champlain and give it a new purpose for generations to come. The fort's long, quiet slumber was about to end. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through Ticonderoga's period of abandonment. It's a powerful reminder that even the mightiest structures are subject to the passage of time. If you found this chapter interesting, please give this video a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next episode, where we'll explore the incredible story of the fort's rescue and rebirth. See you next time. Imagine a world without Google Maps, without travel blogs, without the instant gratification of 1,000 photos just a click away. Now, picture yourself as a traveler. In the 19th century, venturing into lands whispered about in old books and legend. This was the era when our story's forgotten site was rediscovered, not by archaeologists with high-tech gear, but by intrepid travelers, artists with sketchbooks, and budding historians with an insatiable curiosity. For centuries, this place had slept, shrouded in ivy in the mists of time. Its stones held the silent stories of 2 great wars, its grandeur slowly surrendering to nature. But as the 1800s dawned, a new kind of pilgrim began to arrive. These were the Romantics, people who sought not gold or conquest, but beauty in decay, and sublime inspiration in the grandeur of the past. They journeyed on foot, by horse-drawn carriage, or by newly laid railway lines, drawn by whispers of a lost city. What did they find? They found what you and I can only dream of. Ruins untouched by modern life. They saw crumbling walls catching the golden light of dawn, colonnades standing like skeletal fingers against a stormy sky, and wildflowers blooming where kings once walked. It was a scene of haunting beauty, a powerful memento mori, reminder that even the greatest empires eventually return to dust. This wasn't just a tourist spot. It was a profound, almost spiritual experience. Painters were among the first to truly capture its soul. Artists like J.M.W. Turner, known for his dramatic landscapes, and others who followed in his footsteps, set up their easels amidst the rubble. They weren't just documenting stone and mortar. They were capturing an atmosphere. Their canvases came alive with the interplay of light and shadow. The contrast between nature's gentle reclamation and the stark, man-made geometry of the ruins. These paintings, exhibited in the galleries of London, Paris, and Rome, were the 19th century equivalent of going viral. They introduced the sites to a wider public, transforming it from a local legend into an international sensation. People saw these romantic landscapes and felt a yearning to witness the beauty for themselves. The brushstrokes conveyed the melancholy, the AOG, and the sheer romantic power of the place. Following the artists came the writers, poets, essayists, and travel writers dipped their quills in ink to describe what their eyes beheld. They wrote of the haunting beauty, the silent majesty, and the ghostly echoes of history. They described the feeling of standing in a vast, empty amphitheater, imagining the roar of crowds long since silenced. They penned verses about the moon rising over broken aqueducts, describing the site as a relic of 2 great wars, a poignant testament to both creation and destruction. The words, published in popular magazines and travelogues, added a new layer of narrative to the stones. They weren't just ruins anymore. They were the main character in a grand, tragic story. These accounts fueled the burgeoning industry of 19th century tourism. Guidebooks began to include the site, recommending the best routes, the most picturesque views, and even the most suitable inns for a night stay. This rediscovery wasn't a scientific excavation, at least not at first. It was a rediscovery of the heart and the imagination. Early historians and antiquarians began to poke around. Of course, they would measure columns, sketch floor plans, and try to piece together the history from the fragmented clues left behind. They argued over which emperor built which temple, and what battles were fought in the surrounding fields. Their work was often more speculative than scientific, mixing fact with folklore, but it laid the essential groundwork for the more rigorous archaeology that would follow. They were the pioneers, driven by a passion to understand the why and how of this magnificent ruin. They were cataloging the ghosts of the past. The impact of this 19th century fascination was enormous. It saved the site from being completely lost. The attention from artists and writers brought a sense of importance and a desire for preservation. Local landowners, who might have once seen the ruins as a convenient quarry for building materials, began to see them as a treasure, a source of pride, and, increasingly, a source of income from tourism. The romantic vision of the ruins as a beautiful, melancholic landscape paradoxically ensured their survival. Think about the experience of these early visitors. They would have explored without ropes, without designated paths, without do-not-touch signs. They could climb a fallen pillar to get a better view, or have a picnic in the middle of a former forum. It was a raw, unfiltered connection with history. They were not just observing the past. They were living within it, for a fleeting moment. They felt the weight of centuries under their feet and the whispers of forgotten legions on the wind. It was this deeply personal and emotional connection that defined the rediscovery of the 19th century. It wasn't about data points and carbon dating. It was about feeling the pulse of history in a place where time itself seemed to have stopped. So, as we continue our journey, remember this pivotal chapter. The 19th century gave the site its second life. It transformed it from a forgotten relic into an icon of romanticism, a must-see destination for anyone with a soul for history and beauty. The painters captured its image, the writers gave it a voice, and the travelers cemented its place on the map of human heritage. They rediscovered not just stones, but the enduring power of a story etched in the landscape, waiting for new eyes to see and new hearts to feel its haunting, timeless allure. This period of artistic and intellectual reawakening set the stage for all the scientific discovery that was yet to come. Thank you so much for joining me on this part of the journey. If you've enjoyed stepping back in time with us, please give this video a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter in our story. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Welcome back to our journey through time. Today, we're diving into chapter 16 of our series, focusing on a story of revival, dedication, and the birth of a landmark. The Pell family's restoration of Fort Ticonderoga. Imagine the turn of the 20th century. The once mighty Fort Ticonderoga, a witness to epic battles and pivotal moments in American history, lay in ruins. Its stone walls had crumbled, its barracks were gone, and nature was slowly reclaiming the land. For over a century, the fort was a ghost of its former self, a romantic but decaying relic on the shores of Lake Champlain. To many, it seemed destined to fade into history completely. But then, a family with a deep connection to this hallowed ground stepped in. In 1908, Stephen H.P. Pell and his wife, Sarah Gibbs Thompson Pell, purchased the property. But this wasn't just a real estate transaction. It was a passion project, a mission. Stephen Pell had a direct ancestral link to the fort his great-grandfather had served there. For him, this was personal. He saw not just ruins, but the bones of a great American story that needed to be told again. The task ahead was monumental. This wasn't a simple repair job. It was one of America's very first major historic preservation projects. The Pells weren't just rebuilding a fort. They were pioneering a movement. They hired architect Alfred C. Bossam, who embarked on a painstaking process of historical and archaeological research. They didn't want to create a fantasy version of the fort. They wanted to bring the real Fort Ticonderoga back to life, stone by stone. Think about the dedication this required. They sifted through the rubble, uncovering original foundations and thousands of artifacts left behind by the French, British, and American soldiers who had walked these grounds. Each button, each shard of pottery, each cannonball was a clue, a piece of the puzzle. They studied original 18th century plans and drawings, including some found in archives across the Atlantic, to ensure every detail was as accurate as possible. The reconstruction began with the West Barracks. Workers carefully rebuilt the massive stone walls, using the same methods and, wherever possible, the same materials as the original French engineers. It was a slow, deliberate process, driven by a commitment to authenticity. As the walls rose again, the fort began to re-emerge from the landscape, not as a ruin but as a resurrected icon. But the Pell's vision went beyond just rebuilding the structures. They understood that the fort's true value lay in the stories it held. While the reconstruction was underway, they began curating a collection of artifacts. They gathered items found on site and acquired others from around the world that were directly related to the fort's history. This collection would become the heart of their next great endeavor. In 1909, just a year after they began, the Pells opened the Fort Ticonderoga Museum to the public. This was a groundbreaking concept. While the restoration continued, visitors could now walk through the partially rebuilt fort, see the incredible artifacts, and connect with the past in a tangible way. The museum wasn't just a display of old objects. It was a classroom, a time machine, and a memorial. Sarah Pell was instrumental in this. She was a brilliant organizer and visionary who managed the museum's development. She meticulously cataloged the artifacts and designed the exhibits, ensuring that the stories of the soldiers, their families, and the great events that transpired here were told with clarity and passion. Her work transformed a collection of artifacts into a powerful narrative of our nation's founding. The Pell family's effort was more than just a family project. It was a gift to the nation. They poured their personal fortune and immense energy into this restoration, driven by a belief that preserving history was a public duty. They understood that places like Fort Ticonderoga are not just tourist attractions. They are cornerstones of our collective memory. Their work ensured that future generations could stand on these ramparts and feel the echo of history. Over the next several decades, the restoration continued. The other barracks, the bastions, and the outer defenses were all carefully brought back to their 18th century appearance. The Pell family's dedication never wavered. They created a foundation to ensure the fort's preservation long after they were gone, establishing a legacy of stewardship that continues to this day. So, the next time you visit Fort Ticonderoga or see a picture of its majestic walls, remember the Pell family. Remember their vision, their passion, and their groundbreaking work in historic preservation. They didn't just rebuild a fort, they resurrected a legend and created one of America's most important historical sites, safeguarding its stories for all of us. Their legacy is in every stone, every artifact, and every visitor who walks these grounds and connects with the profound history that happened right here. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter of our story. The Pell family's restoration is a powerful reminder of what passion and dedication can achieve. If you found this story as inspiring as I do, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into history. We'd love to have you with us for the next part of our journey. Thanks for watching. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our deep dive into the incredible history of Fort Ticonderoga. In our previous chapters, we've marched through bloody battles, witnessed legendary captures, and seen empires rise and fall around these stone walls. But what happens after the cannons fall silent and the soldiers march home for the last time? That is what we're re-exploring today. The remarkable transformation of Fort Ticonderoga, from a strategic military stronghold into a war museum and a vibrant hub of living history. The story of the fort's decline is as dramatic as its rise. After the American Revolution, Fort Ticonderoga's military importance faded. The frontier pushed westward, and new transportation routes like the Erie Canal bypassed this once critical waterway. The fort, which had been the key to a continent, was abandoned. Its stone walls began to crumble. Its buildings fell into disrepair, and nature started to reclaim the land. For nearly a century, the once mighty fortress became a picturesque ruin, a romantic and overgrown relic of a bygone era. Locals would even come and take stones from the walls to build their own homes and foundations. It seemed as though Fort Ticonderoga was destined to be just a ghost, a footnote in history books. But a new chapter was waiting to be written. The turn of the 20th century saw a renewed interest in American history and preservation. In 1909, a visionary family, the Pells, who had owned the property since the early 19th century, began one of America's first major historic preservation projects. Stephen H.P. Pell and his wife, Sarah Gibbs Thompson Pell, didn't just want to save the ruins. They wanted to bring the fort back to life. They embarked on an ambitious and meticulous reconstruction, using original French plans from the 1750s as their guide. This wasn't a simple repair job. It was an act of historical resurrection. They painstakingly rebuilt the barracks, the bastions, and the iconic walls, determined to restore the fort to its 18th century glory. It was a pioneering effort that set the standard for what we now call living history sites. and what a sight it is today. When you visit Fort Ticonderoga, you're not just looking at old stones. You're stepping back in time. You can walk the very same ramparts, where French sentries scanned the horizon for British ships, where Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys charged in the dead of night, and where General Burgoyne's army celebrated a seemingly easy victory. The air itself feels thick with history. Standing on the walls, looking out over the strategic confluence of Lake Champlain and Lake George, you get a visceral understanding of why this piece of land was so fiercely contested for so long. It connects you to the past in a way that no book or documentary ever could. Inside the reconstructed buildings, the story deepens. Fort Ticonderoga houses one of the most significant collections of 18th century military artifacts in North America. We're talking about thousands upon thousands of items that tell the personal stories behind the grand strategies. You can see the actual cannons that once boomed across the valley, the muskets carried by soldiers from different nations, and even the simple, everyday objects that made up life in a frontier garrison. Clay pipes, uniform buttons, cooking pots, and personal letters. Each artifact is a tangible link to a person who lived, fought, and perhaps died right here. The museum doesn't just display objects. It uses them to narrate the human experience of war. It tells the stories not just of generals and heroes, but of the common soldier, the camp followers, and the Native American allies whose lives were forever changed by the conflicts that centered on this fort. But what truly sets Fort Ticonderoga apart is its commitment to living history. This isn't a quiet, dusty museum. It's alive. On any given day, you'll find historical interpreters in period-correct uniforms and clothing, demonstrating what life was really like in the 1700s. You can watch a blacksmith forge iron tools at a real coal-fired forge, see soldiers perform musket firing drills with thunderous effect, or learn how bread was baked in the fort's stone ovens. These aren't just actors putting on a play. They are skilled educators and craftspeople who have dedicated themselves to understanding and recreating the 18th century with incredible accuracy. They can answer your questions about everything from the tactics of a bayonet charge to the challenges of tailoring a wool uniform by hand. This immersive approach makes the history of the fort accessible and exciting for everyone, from serious history buffs to families with young children. The educational mission extends far beyond the fort's walls. Fort Ticonderoga is a major center for historical research and scholarship. They host seminars, publish journals, and have an incredible library and archive that scholars from around the world use to study the 18th century. They also have a robust series of programs for students and teachers, ensuring that the lessons of Ticonderoga are passed on to the next generation. They understand that preserving a historic site is not just about protecting buildings. It's about preserving and sharing the stories and ideas that those buildings represent. And let's not forget the King's Garden, a stunningly beautiful walled colonial revival garden that was part of Sarah Pell's original vision. It provides a peaceful and beautiful contrast to the military austerity of the fort, showing another side of life and history on this land. So, from a crumbling ruin to a beacon of historical preservation and education, Fort Ticonderoga has completed a remarkable journey. It stands today not as a monument to war, but as a testament to the power of remembrance and the importance of understanding our past. It's a place where you can see history, touch it, and even hear it in the echo of a musket shot across the water. That's a must-see destination for anyone interested in New York history tourism or anyone who simply wants to experience one of America's most important and engaging living history sites. It's a reminder that history isn't just a story in a book. It's a place you can visit, a landscape you can walk, and a story that is still being told. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the rebirth of Fort Ticonderoga. It's truly an inspiring story of preservation and passion. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of our future explorations into history. We'd love to hear about your own experiences at Ticonderoga or other living history sites in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter. Hello history lovers, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we're rejourning to the shores of Lake Champlain to explore a place that is more than just a fortress of stone and earth. We're talking about Fort Ticonderoga, a powerful symbol of American independence and resilience. Now, when you think of Fort Ticonderoga, what comes to mind? Cannons, battles, the American Revolution. You're right, of course. But this historic fort represents so much more than just conflict. It's a testament to the enduring spirit of a nation fighting for its very existence. Let's peel back the layers of time and discover the deeper story etched into these ancient walls. The story of Ticonderoga begins long before the Revolution. Known by the Iroquois as the place between two waters, its strategic location made it a coveted prize for both the French and the British during the French and Indian War. The battles fought here, like the bloody Battle of Carillon in 1758, were brutal and shaped the destiny of North America. These early conflicts laid the groundwork for the military strategies and tensions that would later explode into the War for Independence. But the fort's most iconic moment arrived in the pre-dawn darkness of May 10th, 1775. Ethan Allen, Benedict Arnold, and the Green Mountain Boys stormed the fort in a surprise attack, capturing it from the British without a single shot fired in anger. This wasn't just a military victory. It was a profound psychological blow to the British, and a massive morale boost for the fledgling colonies. It proved that the Continental Army could stand up to the mightiest empire on earth. The capture yielded a treasure trove of heavy artillery, over 100 cannons, mortars, and howitzers. This is where the story of resilience truly begins. Imagine the Herculean task that followed. A young, determined bookseller named Henry Knox proposed an audacious plan: transport these massive guns over 300 miles of frozen wilderness from Ticonderoga to Boston. This noble train of artillery was an incredible feat of engineering and human endurance. Through treacherous mountains, frozen rivers, and deep snow, Knox and his men dragged the heavy cannons using sleds pulled by oxen. This journey, undertaken in the dead of winter, is one of the most inspiring episodes of the Revolution. It demonstrates a level of grit and determination that is almost unimaginable today. The arrival of those cannons in March 1776 changed everything. General Washington positioned them on Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston and the British fleet in the harbor. The British, waking up to find themselves staring down the barrels of their own captured guns, had no choice but to evacuate the city. The cannons from Ticonderoga had secured the first major American victory of the war, forcing the British out of Boston and proving that the colonies were a force to be reckoned with. So, when we look at Fort Ticonderoga, we're not just seeing a military outpost. We're seeing the cradle of a victory. Those cannons weren't just weapons. They were the very tools that helped forge American freedom. The fort became a symbol that independence was not just a dream, but an attainable reality. But the story doesn't end there. The fort was recaptured by the British in 1777, only to be abandoned by them later. Over the years, it fell into ruin, its walls crumbling, a silent witness to the passage of time. For a while, it seemed its legacy might be forgotten, swallowed by nature. This is where the theme of resilience shines. In the early 20th century, the Pell family began a pioneering restoration project, one of the earliest of its kind in America. They painstakingly rebuilt the fort, not as a monument to war, but as an educational center dedicated to preserving its rich history. They understood that these walls embodied centuries of courage, from the native warriors and French soldiers to the British redcoats and American patriots. Today, Fort Ticonderoga stands proudly restored, a living museum. When you walk through its gates, you're stepping into history. You can see the barracks where soldiers slept, touch the cold stone of the ramparts, and gaze out over the same strategic waters that generals once studied. The costumed interpreters, the musket demonstrations, the beautiful King's Gardenet, all works together to bring the 18th century to life. Fort Ticonderoga teaches us that independence isn't a single event, but a continuous process. It's about having the courage to take a stand, the ingenuity to overcome impossible odds, and the resilience to rebuild and preserve what's been won. Its walls have witnessed the clash of empires and the birth of a nation. They've crumbled and been reborn. This fort is a landmark of American independence, a physical embodiment of the nation's journey. It reminds us that our freedom was secured by ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things, fueled by an unwavering belief in their cause. It's a story of courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable human spirit. So the next time you hear the name Ticonderoga, think beyond the battles. Think of Henry Knox's epic journey. Think of the generations who have worked to preserve its legacy. Think of it as a symbol, not just of a war I am, but of an independent spirit that endures to this day. Thank you so much for joining us on this historical journey. If you found this story as inspiring as we do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. Let us know in the comments if you've ever visited Fort Ticonderoga. We'll see you in the next video. Welcome, bike. We've journeyed through the din of battle, the clash of steel, and the thunder of cannons. Now, let the noise fade away. Close your eyes for a moment and just listen. Can you hear it? The gentle lapping of water against ancient stones, the soft whisper of the wind as it moves through the pines. This is the sound of Lake Champlain today. It's a sound of peace, a sound of tranquility. But listen closer. Within that peace, within that quiet, are the echoes of the past. Here, on the shores of Lake Champlain, history isn't just something you read about in a book. It's a presence. It's in the very air you breathe, the ground you walk on. The forts we've explored Ticonderoga, Crown Pointe, aren't just ruins. They are silent storytellers. Each stone, placed by a soldier's hand centuries ago, holds a memory. Each crumbling wall has witnessed acts of incredible bravery and profound loss. Stand on the ramparts at Fort Ticonderoga and look out across the water. Imagine the lake, not as it is now, but as it was. See the reflection of 1,000 campfires on its surface. Hear the distant orders shouted in French, English, and the languages of the First Nations. Picture the tall masts of warships, their sails snapping in the wind, maneuvering for position in a deadly dance that would decide the fate of a continent. Every ripple on the lake's surface seems to carry a piece of that story, a memory of those who built, fought, and gave their lives right here. The soldiers who garrisoned these forts faced unimaginable hardships. They endured brutal winters, with little more than a threadbare wool coat to keep them warm. They faced disease, hunger, and the constant threat of attack. They were far from home, fighting for causes and kings that most of them would never meet. They were young men, Manny Hoost, boys who left behind families and futures for the uncertainties of war on this wild frontier. Think about the sheer human effort it took to construct these massive fortifications. Thousands of men toiling under the summer sun, quarrying stone, felling trees, and digging earthworks, all with hand tools. They weren't just building forts. They were carving a new world out of the wilderness. Their sweat and determination are literally part of the foundation of this land. These structures are a monument to their resilience, their ingenuity, and their sacrifice. And the battles. The history of Lake Champlain is written in the blood that was spilled on its shores and in its waters. From the small-scale skirmishes of the French and Indian War to the pivotal naval battles of the American Revolution and the War of 1812, this lake was a critical strategic highway. Control of Champlain meant control of the corridor between Canada and the American colonies. It was the key, and everyone knew it. Benedict Arnold's ragtag fleet at the Battle of Valcour Island, a desperate, brilliant gamble that delayed the British invasion and helped save the American Revolution. The thunderous naval engagement at the Battle of Plattsburgh, where an American victory secured the northern border of the young United States. These weren't just abstract historical events. They were terrifying, chaotic, and intensely personal struggles for the men involved. Every cannonball that skipped across the water, every splinter of wood that flew from a shattered hull, carried the potential for an abrupt and violent end. It's easy to get lost in the grand strategy, the names of generals, and the dates of battles. But what about the individuals? The anonymous soldier standing guard on a cold, moonless night, his thoughts drifting back to a farm in New England or a village in France. The Mohawk warrior, navigating these woods and waters that his people had called home for generations, now caught between warring European empires. The wife or mother waiting anxiously for a letter that might never come. Their stories are here, too. You can feel them in the quiet corners of the barracks, in the hushed solitude of the old cemeteries, where worn-out headstones bear witness to lives cut short. These echoes are a powerful reminder that history is ultimately a human story. It's a tapestry woven from countless individual threads of hope, fear, courage, and sorrow. Many people who visit these sites speak of a certain feeling, a weight in the air. Some call it the presence of ghosts, the lingering spirits of those who can't leave this place behind. Whether you believe in the supernatural or not, It's undeniable that these grounds are imbued with a powerful emotional energy. The sheer volume of intense human experience, the hope, the terror, the sacrifices left an indelible mark. It is no wonder Lake Champlain's forts are considered among the most haunted sites in America. So, as we stand here, listening to the wind and the water, we are listening to the echoes of centuries. We are bearing witness to the memories of all who came before. The builders, the soldiers, the sailors, the indigenous peoples, the families their lives are woven into the very fabric of this landscape. Every wave that breaks on the shore is a whisper from the past, reminding us of the price of peace and the enduring power of the human spirit. This lake is more than just a beautiful body of water. It is a war memorial, a historical archive, and a sacred ground, all in one. To visit Lake Champlain is to walk through the pages of history, to feel its weight, and to honor the echoes of the voices that still whisper on the wind. It's a profound experience that connects us to our shared past and reminds us of the stories that shape our present. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through time. The stories of this lake are endless, and we've only just begun to explore them. If you found this chapter meaningful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing these important histories to light. Until next time, keep listening for the echoes. The cannons are silent. Now, the musket fire has faded into the soft rustle of leaves, and the battle cries are carried away on the gentle breeze blowing across Lake Champlain. Welcome, history lovers, to our final chapter in this journey. We've walked through smoke and strife, through ambition and defeat, all within these very walls. But today, we stand in a time of peace. The wars are over. Fort Ticonderoga, once the key to a continent, a prize coveted by empires, has found a new purpose. It is no longer a bastion of war, but a guardian of memory. Look around. See the sunlight glinting off the stone, warming the ramparts that once ran cold with tension and fear. Imagine the hands that laid these stones, the soldiers who paced these grounds, their hearts with the weight of Jigichtain. Their lives, their sacrifices, are not lost. They're etched into the very fabric of this place. Each wall, each bastion, each reconstructed barracks tells a story. This isn't just a pile of old rocks and wood. It's a classroom, and its lessons are profound. It teaches us about the costs of freedom, the complexities of conflict, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Standing here, you can almost feel the echoes of the past, the determined footsteps of Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys, the strategic genius of Benedict Arnold in his earlier, heroic days, the disciplined march of British regulars, and the resolute stand of the Continental Army. They all passed through here, leaving their indelible mark. The fort stands as a testament to the idea that history is not just a subject in a book. It's a living, breathing entity. It surrounds us, informs our present, and shapes our future. When you walk through the Sally Port, you're not just passing through an old doorway. You're stepping through a portal in time. You're connecting with the generations who came before, who dreamed, fought, and hoped for a better world, right on this very spot. The historical legacy of Fort Ticonderoga is immense. Its strategic importance during the French and Indian War and the American Revolution cannot be overstated. Control of this fortress meant control of the vital waterway connecting Canada to the Hudson River Valley. It changed hands multiple times, each transfer of power marking a pivotal moment in the shaping of North America. It saw grand campaigns and desperate sieges, moments of great valor and of tactical folly. It's a microcosm of the entire colonial struggle. But now, the struggle is of a different kind. It's a struggle against forgetting. In our fast-paced modern world, it's easy to lose touch with the events that forged our nations. That's why places like this are so vital. As one of New York's most significant landmarks, Fort Ticonderoga is more than a tourist destination. It is a sacred trust. It's been meticulously restored, not to glorify war, but to honor the memory of all who served and sacrificed here. The work of preservationists, archaeologists, and historians ensures that these stories are told accurately and with the respect they deserve. Think of the fort not as a monument to conflict, but as a monument to resilience. It was built, captured, recaptured, fell into ruin, and was reborn. Its own story mirrors the nations that fought over it. It shows us that even after the most devastating conflicts, life finds a way to return. Grass grows over the earthworks. Wildflowers bloom in the fields where armies once camped, and the quiet lapping of the lake replaces the roar of artillery. It's a powerful symbol of peace triumphing over war. It reminds us that history is not silent. It's always whispering. You just have to be willing to listen. You hear it in the wind whistling through the embrasures. You feel it in the cool, solid stone beneath your fingertips. You see it in the panoramic view from the ramparts, a view that has remained largely unchanged for centuries. It's a whisper that tells us about courage, about sacrifice, and about the enduring quest for a better future. The fort is a teacher. It teaches us that even the mightiest fortresses can fall, that empires can crumble, and that a new world can be built from the ashes of the old. It teaches us that the struggles of the past have a direct bearing on the freedoms we enjoy today. Visiting a place like Fort Ticonderoga today is an act of remembrance. It's a way of saying thank you to those who came before us. It's an acknowledgement that our present was built upon their past. And so, we conclude our journey not with the clang of swords, but with a serene reflection. The fort stands, no longer as a military stronghold, but as a sentinel of history. It holds the memories of soldiers and generals, of families and artisans, of triumphs and tragedies. It's a quiet, powerful reminder that even in the deepest silence, the whispers of history speak volumes, telling us who we were and reminding us of who we can aspire to be. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible exploration of Fort Ticonderoga's past. If you've enjoyed this journey through history, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories like this. Your support helps us continue to bring the past to life. Until next time, keep listening for the whispers.